They thought death would silence him. But even the grave wasn't enough. The year was 897. Rome gathered not to crown a king, not to mourn a pope, but to put a corpse on trial. Pope Formosus had been dead for months, his body exhumed, dressed in sacred robes, and placed on a throne. The living judges sat across from the rotting remains, accusing him of crimes against the church, as if he could answer. His skeletal hand was forced to swear oaths. His decaying lips, unable to speak, were spoken for by a trembling deacon. The crowd watched in horror. Priests, nobles, and commoners pressed close, not daring to look away. This wasn't justice. It was theater, a warning, a punishment dragged from the underworld itself. The question was not whether he was guilty. The verdict had already been chosen. It was about humiliation, about erasing him, body and soul, branding him a traitor even in death. And as the trial reached its grotesque conclusion, the sentence fell not only on the dead pope, but on the living world that dared to judge the corpse. What kind of power fears a man so much that even his corpse must stand trial? And what truth were they trying to bury with him? The spectacle was called the Cadaver Synod, a trial not of the living, but of the dead. Pope Formosus, dragged from his tomb, placed on a throne as if he were alive again. But this was no resurrection. It was desecration, sanctioned by those who believed power could reach even beyond the grave. Formosus had not been an obscure pope. He had ruled Rome for 5 years, navigating alliances and betrayals, crowning kings and angering enemies in both Italy and beyond. He was a diplomat and survivor in an era where every word, every blessing, could mean the rise or fall of kings. He made choices that shifted the balance of power, and for some, those choices were unforgivable. His death should have ended the feud. But the man who now wore the papal crown, Pope Stephen VI, thought otherwise. He demanded not only victory in life, but domination over death. The trial was staged in the Lateran Basilica. Witnesses came not to testify, but to gawk. Soldiers, bishops, cardinals, all gathered to see what had never been seen before. A corpse accused of treason. The body was propped upright, dressed in holy robes, a mockery of its former glory. Beside him, a terrified deacon stood, forced to answer questions on behalf of the rotting pope. It was not justice. It was humiliation. A ritual execution performed under the guise of law. The charges were sweeping, usurping the papacy, violating canon law, conspiring with rival kingdoms, crimes so broad they could fit any narrative Stephen wished. And with each accusation, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some gasped, others whispered, but none dared speak openly. To protest was to risk joining the corpse in condemnation. To remain silent was to legitimize the grotesque theater unfolding before them. Why was this done? Because Formosus had crowned Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, defying the powerful Spoleto family, whose blood now tied itself to the throne of Rome. The Spoletos wanted the imperial crown in their own grasp. Stephen VI, loyal to Spoleto, wanted to erase Formosus's legacy, to brand him not as pope but as fraud. And so the Cadaver Synod unfolded, a grotesque puppet show where the corpse sat in judgment, unable to resist. The degradation was deliberate. As the ritual deepened, the atmosphere turned more dreadful. Clerics stripped the corpse of its sacred vestments, the fingers used for blessings, his right hand, once raised to anoint, were cut off. The body slumped, the deacon trembling beside it, voice cracking as he recited guilt on behalf of the dead. Each act was symbolic. To strip him of robes was to strip him of papal authority. To sever his fingers was to deny him the power to bless or absolve. It was not merely about punishment. It was erasure enacted before the eyes of all Rome. The verdict was never in doubt. Formosus was declared guilty, his papacy invalidated, his acts nullified. But even this was not enough. His body was dragged from the basilica, through the streets of Rome, jeered at and spat upon. Then, as though final insult were required, the corpse was hurled into the Tiber River. A pope of Rome, reduced to refuse, abandoned to the current like a common criminal. Yet even water does not always carry away what men wish forgotten. Whispers spread through the city. Some claim the body did not sink, but floated, bloated and pale, a ghastly reminder of what had been done. Others said the corpse washed back to shore, carried by the current as though the river itself refused to hide the crime. Some whispered of miracles, that the desecrated body cursed those who touched it, that storms raged after his body was cast away. Fear took root, and with fear came doubt, not of Formosus but of Stephen, who had ordered this spectacle. What began as an act of power soon turned into an omen of doom. The people of Rome, who had once stood silent, began to murmur openly. Was God displeased? Had the church itself crossed a line that could not be crossed? Did justice end here, or had something far darker begun? The corpse had been silenced, but the city had not. And in that silence, a dangerous new question lingered. Who would be next on the throne of the accused? The cadaver synod had ended with a corpse declared guilty, a pope's body mutilated, and the river carrying away what was left. But Rome could not wash itself clean so easily. The images haunted those who had seen it. Priests whispered of sacrilege. Nobles spoke of curses. Commoners crossed themselves, fearing divine retribution. Something in the city shifted. The horror meant to humiliate Formosus had instead stained Pope Stephen VI with a deeper mark. Stephen had intended to erase his enemy's memory. Instead, he had turned Rome itself into a theater of nightmares. And people remembered nightmares. They remembered the sight of the corpse, propped like a grotesque doll, its hands severed, its body flung into the Tiber. They remembered the trembling deacon, the mockery of oaths, the hollow judgment pronounced over bones. The church was supposed to speak with the voice of heaven. Instead, it had shouted with the voice of madness. Soon the murmurs grew into unrest. Some said Stephen was possessed, his mind broken by hatred. Others claimed he had angered God, and Rome would suffer for his blasphemy. A strange fear gripped the city, not of Formosus, but of what the trial meant. If the church could put the dead on trial, then no one, alive or gone, was safe. Memory itself could be dragged into the court, rewritten, condemned. Death no longer promised rest. The omens piled up. When floods struck the Tiber soon after, people swore it was the river's revenge, vomiting out the body of the disgraced pope. Rumors spread that Formosus's corpse had reappeared on the banks, uncorrupted, staring up at the city that had judged him. Whether truth or invention, the story spread like fire, burning Stephen's reputation to ash. The spectacle he had staged to show power had instead revealed weakness. He could not silence the dead, nor the whispers of the living. By the summer of 897, unrest had boiled over. Riots shook Rome. Crowds demanded justice, not for Formosus, but against Stephen. The pope who had placed a corpse on trial now found himself judged by the living. The same mob that had once gathered to watch him desecrate a corpse now gathered to desecrate his name. When the prison walls finally closed around him, it was not the grandeur of basilicas or the loyalty of nobles that stood with him. It was silence, desertion, betrayal. Stephen VI was strangled in his cell. The pope who condemned the dead was condemned himself by the living. His reign ended in violence, his body tossed aside like the man he had humiliated. Rome had seen justice of a kind, but justice twisted, violent, soaked in irony. Yet the story did not end with Stephen's death. The church was fractured, shaken by the spectacle. Each new pope had to decide, would they align with Formosus or against him? Would they recognize his ordinations, his decrees, his crownings? Or would they risk their own authority by declaring him illegitimate? The cadaver synod cast a shadow over every successor. To stand for or against Formosus was to invite enemies, and perhaps, in time, to share his fate. One pope annulled the cadaver synod, declaring Formosus's acts valid once more. Another reversed it, cursing his name again. The pendulum swung back and forth, as though the corpse of Formosus still sat on its throne, pulling strings from the grave. Each reversal deepened the confusion. Was the church guided by God or by fear, vengeance, and politics? Even Arnulf of Carinthia, the emperor Formosus had crowned, found his legacy entangled in the dispute. His authority too was questioned, for if Formosus was invalid, then was Arnulf's coronation invalid as well? The power of kings, the sanctity of crowns, all hung on the bones of a dead pope. And in that fragile world, no crown, no throne was safe from crumbling. The people of Rome no longer trusted their shepherds. They looked at the throne of St. Peter not as a symbol of unity, but as a battlefield, a stage where popes destroyed one another even in death. Violence stalked the papacy. Assassinations, imprisonments, and sudden deaths followed. Each pontiff looked over his shoulder, fearing betrayal, fearing the precedent Formosus had left behind. His corpse had become a phantom that haunted the church. And in that chaos, one truth became undeniable. The cadaver synod had changed history, not because of what Formosus had done in life, but because of what men did to him in death. The trial of a corpse had put the living church on trial, and in the eyes of many, the church had failed. The cadaver synod did not end with a corpse on a throne. It did not end with fingers severed, robes torn, verdicts shouted, and a body hurled into the Tiber. It did not even end with the rope that closed around Pope Stephen VI's neck. What Rome had staged was not a single outrage, but a template, proof that power could chase memory into the grave and still try to strangle it. In the weeks after Stephen's death, Rome tried to breathe again. But breath carries rumor, and rumor became doctrine, and doctrine became knives. Councils were called, decrees drafted, and men swore oaths to reverse the irreversible. Pope Romanus attempted to quiet the storm. He annulled the corpse trial and restored Formosus's acts. He spoke like a healer, but he ruled only for months. He fell, thrown down by the same factions that had watched a corpse be judged. Some said he was poisoned. Others said he was forced aside. In an age when verdicts changed as quickly as guards at a door, no one trusted the posted notices. You could not nail certainty to a church door when the hinges themselves were loosening. Theodore II rose like a brief flare. He gathered bishops, condemned the synod as sacrilege, and ordered what felt like the only pious act left: fined Formosus. Dragged from the river's filth, the body was washed, vested, and reburied among popes. Theodore died after 20 days. 20 days to lift a curse and then silence. Was it fever? Was it fear? Rome did not agree on the cause, it agreed only on the pattern. Those who touched the memory of Formosus did not hold power long. John IX attempted order. He convened synods at Ravenna and elsewhere, banned trials of the dead, and reaffirmed that Formosus's ordinations and coronations stood. For a heartbeat, the church seemed to remember its own spine. Yet the heartbeat faltered. The Roman nobility traded favors, German and Italian princes tugged at the papal chair, and the law that said the dead should not be judged became itself a contested thing. The corpse on the throne had turned canon law into wet clay. Then Sergius III arrived, and with him returned the corpse's shadow. He had been a rival years earlier, forced out, biding time. When he seized the papacy, he reversed the reversals, declared the cadaver synod valid, and damned Formosus again. With a sentence, he dragged Rome back into the nightmare, because a curse repeated starts sounding like truth. The pendulum did not swing between justice and injustice. It swung between memory and erasure, between a dead man's hand and the living hands that feared it. Outside Rome, kings counted and recalculated. If Formosus was a fraud, then the crowns he placed on heads were counterfeit. Arnulf of Carinthia, the emperor he had crowned, found rivals whispering that his legitimacy was paper-thin. The Spoletans, whose bloodline coveted the imperial halo, used the cadaver's condemnation as a lever, prying at the empire's joints. Bishops who had traced their authority to Formosus suddenly bore marks like brands. Enemies could say their sacraments were void, their consecrations air. Under banners and mitres, men argued over a corpse, and armies moved. Sermons turned into orders. Orders turned into armored men. Swords glittered. Declarations followed like arrows. On Roman streets, it was not philosophy that ruled, but fear. A decision in a chamber meant torches at night. A rumor from an altar meant blood under stairways. People recalled the corpse trial every time a pope changed a decree. They had seen how easily the past could be resculpted. If a dead pope could be declared never to have been pope, then a marriage could be declared never to have been a marriage, a bishop never to have been a bishop, a king never to have been anointed. The ground under ordinary lives felt less like stone and more like stitched parchment. One knife in the seam would open. Everyone understood the lesson. Power was continuity, and continuity was being cut, stitched, and cut again. Rome became expert at silence. Priests learned which names to say and which to drop from sermons. Deacons learned that a voice could be requisitioned to speak for the dead and then punished for how the dead sounded. Families allied themselves to factions not for theology, but for survival. Spoleto or Corinthia, Ravenna or Lateran, Formason or Antiformason. Children grew into a church where the difference between law and vengeance was measured in who carried the keys that week. Some said the river kept secrets. The Tiber had swallowed the corpse once, returned it, swallowed it again. When rain swelled, old women muttered that the water remembered, that it brought silt and bones to the places where unjust words were spoken. The basilica where the corpse had sat became a place pilgrims approached with a double mind, reverence and recoil, as if holiness could still be contaminated by what had been done in holy vestments. No edict could outpace the image of a dead man forced to answer charges with a deacon's quaking voice. It is easy to call the century mad and pass on, but madness is often a mask for clarity no one can bear to face. The Cadaver Synod revealed what all realms fear, that legitimacy is a story we tell together, and a story can be untold. Formosis's enemies tried to unmake him retroactively, like erasing a name from a ledger and insisting the books had always looked that way. His allies tried to print the name in ink that would never run. Between them, Rome saw the truth that terrifies rulers. Memory has teeth. It bites after burial. Stephen VI's rope solved nothing. It proved only that outrage breeds retribution, and retribution breeds ritual. By killing Stephen, Rome made him into a warning. By reversing him, it made him into a precedent. The church outlawed trials of the dead, then allowed their verdicts to be cited as if they were lawful scripture. The law did not know what to do with the stain, so it tried to write around it. The stain bled through. There were quieter tragedies. A bishop ordained by Formosus sat at his desk at night, listening to doors, certain he would be denounced in the morning. A young monk copied a charter twice because his abbot whispered that tomorrow the names might change. A widow searched for the priest who had blessed her marriage, not for comfort, but for proof, because a neighbor had told her a different pope had called the blessing void. Faith became paper, and paper became a battlefield. Centuries later, scholars would trace the contour of those years and say, here is where cynicism entered the bloodstream of Europe. Here is where the idea took root that institutions could be as mortal as men, that sacred offices could be puppets, that the past itself could be edited by decree. Princes did not forget it. Reformers would later hurl the Cadaver Synod like a spear at Rome's pride. Artists would paint the corpse on the throne in their minds and find in the grotesque a bleak sort of insight, that the distance between rite and spectacle is a single intention, domination. And yet beneath the paperwork and blood, beneath the councils and counter-councils, one simple image remained, a throne facing judges, and on it a body dressed to look alive. The scene was not only blasphemy, it was theater designed to crush a legacy. But legacies do not crush when staged against them. They harden. Formosus became larger in death than he had ever been in life. He became an axis, and every pope after had to declare where he stood relative to that axis. Why did they need a body to win an argument? Because the living forget, and the dead cannot answer. Because an idea without a face is easy to ignore, but a corpse in robes turns abstraction into terror. Because it is one thing to say, he was never pope, and another to force a city to look at its former shepherd and call him impostor to his face. The Cadaver Synod was Rome's attempt to edit doctrine with a knife. The scar remains. So Rome learned to live with a ghost. It learned to talk softly around his name. It learned that power which tries to rewrite the past ends by testifying to the past power. And in quiet moments, when torches guttered and scribes laid down their pens, someone would always ask the question no decree could smother. If the dead can be judged, who among the living is safe? If a throne can be turned into a stage, what is the throne for? And if memory can be tried, what verdict will it return when it is our turn to face it? By the dawn of the 10th century, the Cadaver Synod had already become more than an event. It was a parable, and like all parables, it spread beyond the walls where it had been staged. Across Europe, word of the corpse trial traveled in whispers, in sermons, in the bitter jokes of rival courts. Rome, once the city of saints, was now mocked as the city of spectacle, the city that dragged its own shepherd into court long after death had claimed him. The papacy should have stood as the anchor of Christendom. Instead, it seemed to drift like wreckage. Kings asked themselves what Rome's blessings were worth if they could be rescinded after burial. Bishops trembled, knowing their ordinations could be invalidated by decree. Even ordinary believers wondered, if sacraments could be undone, what did faith mean? The Church's strength lay in its claim to permanence, to eternal continuity. But continuity had been shattered when a pope's memory could be swung like a weapon, exalted one year and nullified the next. The result was not merely theological confusion, it was political chaos. Factions in Rome turned ever bloodier, with mobs rising and falling like tides. The Lateran Palace, meant to symbolize sacred order, instead echoed with shouts of depositions, conspiracies, strangulations. Popes became pawns, their reigns brief, their ends violent. Leo V was imprisoned by his own successor. John X was smothered to death in his bedchamber. Benedict VI was strangled with cords. Boniface VI reigned for 15 days before dying in shadow. Each death carried the fingerprints of factional vengeance, of the poison that had first seeped from the corpse trial. Each murder, each deposition, each betrayal was tied, directly or indirectly, to the precedent of Formosus. His ghost haunted the papal throne, his corpse still sitting in a sense beside every successor. The more they tried to deny him, the more his memory weighed like lead on their crowns. Outside Rome, enemies of the papacy rejoiced. Byzantine courtiers laughed at the West, saying their emperors killed men, but at least left corpses alone. Frankish lords spread tales of Rome's madness as proof that the Holy See was unfit to guide kingdoms. Even within Italy, rival nobles sneered that St. Peter's throne had become a stage for grotesque theater, not a seat of God's chosen. Every echo of the cadaver synod weakened Rome's voice, and every weakening meant greater risk of invasion, rebellion, and decay. But perhaps most dangerous was what happened inside the mind of believers. Faith, once rooted in certainty, now bent under suspicion. When a widow went to the altar, she asked herself whether the priest's blessing would still count in 10 years, or if another pope would call it void. When a knight knelt to swear fealty on relics, he wondered if the hand that consecrated them had been Formosan, and whether that meant his oath was cursed. A midwife, baptizing a child with trembling hands, whispered a prayer not only for the infant's soul, but that the Church would not one day erase the act altogether. Religion became infected with doubt, and doubt is more corrosive than heresy, for heresy at least declares itself openly. Doubt lingers, grows, poisons the air. The Church could defend itself against heretics. It could not defend itself against the questions in every believer's mind. Still, amid the despair, the memory of Formosus did not vanish. In fact, it grew. His name became a quiet rallying cry for those who distrusted papal politics. To speak of him was to speak of defiance. His corpse had been degraded, but his legend had been sharpened. Every reversal of his verdict, every pope who rose or fell on his memory, carved his story deeper into Rome's stone. In trying to bury him, Stephen VI had immortalized him. The cadaver synod was supposed to erase a man. Instead, it stained an institution, and no washing, no reversal, no decree could cleanse it away. The stain had seeped too deep into parchment, into blood, into memory. And once a stain becomes part of history, it can never truly be washed away. The cadaver synod revealed a truth darker than the mutilated body of a pope. It showed that memory itself could be corrupted, judged, and rewritten. In an age where parchment was fragile and chronicles could be altered by the hands of victors, what chance did truth have? The trial of Formosus was more than a grotesque spectacle. It was an admission that the past could be treated like clay, reshaped to serve those who held the knife. This was the hidden terror that spread from Rome to the farthest courts of Christendom. Kings and princes looked at what had been done and saw not just blasphemy, but opportunity. If a pope could be tried after death, then so could a rival's memory. If decrees could be declared null, then an entire dynasty's legitimacy could be erased. To destroy a man's reputation was no longer enough. You could destroy the very record of his life, declare his deeds undone, and leave him stranded in a second death. Erasure. The corpse on the throne was not simply Formosus. It was every ruler, every priest, every soul who feared that their legacy might be stolen once they were gone. In this sense, the Cadaver Synod was not an isolated madness, but a mirror, reflecting the fears of a continent where power was fragile and lineage contested. What Rome had done openly, others would do in subtler ways, rewriting charters, forging documents, silencing chronicles. The difference was that Rome had made the process literal, physical, undeniable, a corpse seated in judgment. And in the centuries that followed, the Cadaver Synod became legend. Chroniclers did not forget it. Artists did not forget it. Preachers used it as warning, reformers as proof, skeptics as ammunition. It became a shorthand for corruption, a symbol for how far men will go to control narratives. The corpse became an emblem of Rome's madness, of politics unchained, of memory weaponized. But within Rome itself, the lesson ran deeper. Priests whispered that the trial had awakened something the church could never put back to sleep. The knowledge that faith itself was bound by memory, and memory could be broken. Every priest who blessed a child, every bishop who ordained a successor, every pope who crowned a king, all of them carried the silent question, will this endure, or will it be erased? Continuity was no longer guaranteed. Eternity had been cracked. Some said the curse was visible, that after Formosus, no pope sat securely. The tiara became a crown of thorns, heavy not with jewels, but with suspicion. Even centuries later, when emperors marched on Rome or reformers shouted against it, echoes of the corpse on the throne could be heard. The idea that memory could be judged had outlived the men who conceived it. It had become a principle, grim and enduring. This was the true legacy of the Cadaver Synod. Not just that Rome humiliated a corpse, not just that Stephen VI strangled himself in history, but that all who came after carried the knowledge that the dead were not safe and the past was not closed. Power could reach backward as easily as forward. No grave was deep enough to silence politics. No tomb heavy enough to smother ambition. And as long as memory could be made a weapon, there would always be another trial waiting, whether in a courtroom, in a chronicle, or in the whispered judgment of history. The corpse of Formosus had been reduced to bones and dust, but the image of his body seated on a throne, forced to answer charges with no voice of his own, became eternal. Rome had staged a play it could never end. The curtain still hangs heavy, reminding all who seek power that death itself is not escape. To live in history is to live at risk of being retried forever. They said the trial of Formosus was meant to end a feud. It did not. It was meant to silence a legacy. It only amplified it. It was meant to prove that even the dead could be made to answer for their crimes. Instead, it proved that the living could never escape their fear of the dead. The image remains, a corpse dressed in holy robes, propped upon a throne, its lifeless hand raised by trembling fingers, its silence filled by the voice of another. That image has outlived every pope who judged him, every faction that cursed him, every king whose crown depended on him. For centuries, long after bones had turned to dust, Formosus continued to sit in judgment, not as defendant, but as symbol. A symbol of how fragile authority is, how easily faith can be poisoned, how quickly power reveals its terror of memory. The Cadaver Synod was supposed to erase. Instead, it exposed. It stripped away the illusion that death ends the contest for power. It showed that memory is battlefield, legacy is contested ground, and graves are only doorways through which ambition can still march. Stephen VI believed he could destroy an enemy by dragging him from the tomb, but all he did was teach the world that even the tomb is not safe. That lesson is darker than the trial itself. And what is more terrifying than that fear? That men who wield power cannot endure even the memory of opposition. That they must desecrate graves, rewrite charters, mutilate corpses, all to control what lingers when flesh is gone. The Cadaver Synod was not about Formosus alone. It was about memory, about the terror of being remembered in ways you cannot control. That is why the story still chills us, because we recognize ourselves in it. We too fear what will remain when we are no longer here to defend it. History remembers Stephen VI as mad. Perhaps he was, but perhaps madness was only the mask of a deeper truth, that he knew memory outlives decree, and he tried to crush it before it crushed him. His rope did not save him. His verdict did not survive him. Yet his act lingers, casting a shadow longer than his reign, longer than his life. And every pope who followed, every reformer who pointed back at Rome, every skeptic who doubted its sanctity, all of them carried that shadow. The corpse in robes had become immortal in ways no living pope could match. The church survived, yes, Rome survived, but something broke that day that was never repaired. Trust bled out into the streets, carried down the Tiber with the body of Formosus. Centuries of reform and ritual tried to cover the wound, but the scar never vanished. Even now, when historians write of it, when believers hear of it, the same shudder runs down the spine. The recognition that death does not grant safety. That legacy is not in our hands. Perhaps that is the final curse of the Cadaver Synod. Not that Formosus was condemned, not that Stephen VI was strangled, but that we, the living, cannot look away. We see ourselves in that corpse, dressed up, forced to sit, judged by powers that outlast us. And we know when the verdict is read, it will not be our voice that speaks. It will be someone else's, trembling, reading guilt into the silence. The trial was staged more than 1,000 years ago, yet its lesson has never aged. The dead do not rest, memory is never safe, and if the past can be retried once, it can be retried again. For every throne is also a stage, and every silence is waiting to be filled by another's words. So the question lingers, cold and unyielding, echoing across centuries. When your time ends and your body lies still, will your story be buried with you? Or will someone drag you back, seat you on a throne, and make your silence speak against you?